Hey everyone, Kyle Copey and Dave Gordon here. We welcome you back. We are talking about invalid masses due to invalid wine. This has been in the news recently. It's a pretty disturbing thing if you're a Catholic, if you care at all about what goes on at your mass, and if things are done properly. If that concerns you at all, this story will concern you. So recently, I think it came from some internal memos, maybe some emails that got sent out publicly. But we know that the Archbishop of Kansas City in Kansas, Joseph Naumann, Archbishop Naumann, has found several, according to a couple priests in his archdiocese. These priests have discovered that the various parishes that they've been visiting, at least three parishes in his archdiocese, have been using incorrect wine at Mass. Now, maybe you don't understand why this is. Maybe you think any wine will do. That's actually not the case. We're going to explain to you exactly why that is and why that matters. So, what was going on? So, at least two different priests in at least three different parishes noticed that when they got put there as I don't know if they were a guest or a new assignment or whatever, they discovered that the sacristans, the wine that was being used, was, I believe, apricot wine. It was not grape wine, not the stuff that Jesus used, and that's really the whole point of this stuff. You have to use the correct matter. Every sacrament has a form, the words that the minister has to say to make the sacrament happen, and matter, the proper material that the sacrament needs to be used in the sacrament to confect it. If any of those two things are missing, if the priest says the wrong thing, if he uses the wrong thing, like apricot wine, not grape wine, in the Eucharist, it invalidates the sacrament. It doesn't really happen. So that wine never got changed into the body of Christ, and it actually invalidated the Mass, which has all kinds of bad consequences for people that attend that Mass and the ripple effects at large. Dave, what the heck is going on here?
How could this happen ever? That's the whole thing. Like, if the seminaries are in such a state of disarray that you have, priests graduating and getting ordained that don't know what the proper matter for the Eucharist is, and specifically, the wine, which is to become the precious blood. How can this ever happen? Like, I didn't know that you couldn't use Fanta grape soda to confect, to consecrate. How does that happen? Apricot wine? First of all, who the hell drinks apricot wine? That's another thing. That points to like a gay problem in the seminaries. If you have like priests out there that are having like apricot wine, that's like the appletini of wine. That's like, we used peach schnapps. Like, that is so gay. Who gets apricot wine? That's an insult to wine itself. I think. I'm not like some wine guy either.
They probably had umbrellas in them. That'll tip you off.
Exactly. No, we're just having wine coolies for the Eucharist. Like, how does this ever happen in the church that obviously has codified everything you need to know about sacramental theology? All this stuff is out there for priests to go, and if they need resources, if they need to learn what to do, maybe they're a little unsure, maybe they did have a poor education, poor seminary formation. It's not like there's some big mystery about this. You can go to like 50,000 apologetics websites or like EWTN.com or like JimmyAkin.com to find out what the proper matter for the precious blood actually is. It's not supposed to be some big mystery. So yeah, I'm kind of with you in asking, how does this happen in a world?
I don't know. I mean, the only explanation that I could think of is that the priests who are using this, I don't think they're ignorant. I don't think that they were never taught this stuff in seminary. Maybe that's the case, given some of these seminaries out there. But this is like really basic stuff to the faith. So what I would suspect is that I would suspect that they have no faith, that they don't believe in the real presence, that they don't believe in transubstantiation. They just think it's some sort of like Protestant understanding of, a ritual ceremony that represents the body and blood of Christ, but it's not really. And if that's the case, yeah, use whatever the hell you want. Use a Ritz cracker because it's not really doing anything. And
Dude, I used to be more of your mindset. I really did. I worked for a priest though, and he was one of these guys where he would confess. He'd be like, "Yeah, I just had bad seminary formation." So he would teach the parishioners like, "Oh, it was sharing." The miracle of the transformation of loaves and fishes. It was really just sharing of the fishes, and there was nothing miraculous that actually happened. People just brought their supplies from home and shared with everybody, and that was the miracle. And I was like, no, that's not right. Like, I worked directly under him. I had meetings with him quite frequently. So I'd be like, these things are not correct. This is incorrect. And he'd be like, oh, well, your formation's so much better than mine. I just didn't know that. A lot of times, these guys, even when it seems like an almost unbelievable level of ignorance, Kyle, like they are acting in ignorance. So I'm not saying you're wrong for sure, because we know there's a lot of malicious liturgical abuse out there. We do. And we know that certain priests just kind of had an animosity towards the faith and decided to like strip their altars after Vatican II, make their churches into ugly behemoths, take out all the sacred art, take out everything that draws the hearts and mind to God, because they really had, lackluster faith or no faith at all, and perhaps some animosity even towards the church. We know that's the case for some people. At the same time, I'd say in my experience, it's ignorance to a level that I almost find unbelievable. I find myself struggling to believe that how could you make it not only through like Catholic grade school, but like through seminary and then through your ministry without knowing these things. But nevertheless, it has been my experience that in the majority of cases, a lot of this is just ignorance of the most, disgusting kind.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something to be said about poor formation, and that very well may have been the case here. I wonder if, this is obviously taking place at 3 parishes that we know of in one diocese. How widespread is this? Is this going on in different dioceses? Is this going on around the world? We just don't know. I mean, there's been times where I've even questioned the matter of the Eucharist growing up. Not so much the bread. I've heard stories of people having, like, they find like seeds and nuts and honey in their so-called Eucharist, and that would be a similar case to this. That would invalidate that.
Rice cakes.
Yeah. Have you like received any of those? Have you ever seen those in person?
No, actually, my Eucharistic experience in terms of the actual matter of the sacrament has been very, very orthodox throughout my whole life.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the bread, the hosts, I've never seen a problem personally in my own experience. I know other people have. I've heard other people talk about it, obviously. But in terms of the wine, there's been some questionable wine out there. Mostly I don't receive under both species. I attend the traditional Latin Mass quite frequently, and if you don't, only the priest receives the precious blood there. But even at Novus Ordo, I skip the wine. But when I used to take it frequently, and I was still kind of coming back to my faith, I would notice, it was I tasted some really sweet wines. So I very well may have been a victim of this as well. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there can be sweet wines based on the type of actual grapes they're using.
Right.
And it's my understanding that as long as it's basically pure grapes with maybe only a tiniest hint of preservative, then that is going to be valid matter for the sacraments. But you can't have like the commingling of like elderberry or like blackberry or apricot, and that does make it invalid matter. So you can have like port. Port is like a sweet wine, but that's made of, a certain kind of grapes. Um, Obviously, the flavor of wine is going to differ based on what grapes are used in the fermentation process. So that might not actually have invalidated it. It could just be, there is a disparity in the wines that you can use for the precious blood.
Yeah, and that's what we want to make it clear to people out there. Your people's hearts are in the right place. You, as a layperson, are not necessarily responsible for doing all this investigation and making sure that your priest is doing everything exactly correct. It's sort of outside of your purview. I mean, if you notice something super egregious, yeah, obviously you have the right and duty to bring that up. But we want people to understand that, as you said, it's very simple when it comes to this matter stuff. In the Eucharist, we want to use exactly what Jesus used in the Last Supper. It's got to be as pure grape wine as you can get it. What would you mentioned, you can't add anything unnecessary there. That's the key. So adding sugar to the wine would be unnecessary. What could be necessary is, like you said, some type of preservatives. The classic one is the sulfites in wine. This is one of the reasons why I don't personally drink a lot of red wine. I love red wine, but the sulfites, the preservatives, would mess with me. I would get sort of an allergic, minor allergic reaction to it. I had some wine without, very low sulfites. Some without it, and that I did a lot better with that. But that's really the only thing that you can put in wine. And from what I understand, the certification process to see if this grape wine is actually sacramentally certified, I mean, it's very kind of wishy-washy from diocese to diocese. Some bishops have a list of, certain wines that their priests can buy. Some have, vineyards actually in the diocese, and that's where they go to get it. They ship it in or whatever. So it's, perhaps, the church needs to have better legislation about this. Maybe that's asking too much.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think the more clarity you can have on something like this, obviously, the better off you're going to be, because people do want access and should have access and have a right to access to these sacramental graces. People, the faithful, the baptized faithful who are in a state of grace, have a right to access the Holy Eucharist. So it's important that the church gets this right. This isn't something you can just be like, well, we did our best, if you're the priest. Like you better make damn sure that you're giving people the properly confected, the efficaciously confected Eucharist. But on the other hand, we should say this to people who might be worried, because hearing this, it's like, man, I hope all my sacraments have been valid, especially like the non-repeatable ones. But especially, even the repeatable ones, it's like, I hope I'm getting weekly Holy Eucharist and that my absolution is valid, and yada yada yada. It is something that kind of haunts my nightmares. Like, did I get validly baptized? Is my Eucharist, have the masses I've been attending, have they been valid masses? And I think that's a part of us that can get a little scrupulous. So what we'd say to somebody like that is, obviously, if you're not having validly confected Eucharist, then you're not getting the sacramental graces. So, in other words, graces are not being produced within you by the sacraments that you're receiving. And that's a shame. But that doesn't mean you're suddenly like cut off from friendship with God, or that you aren't meriting grace for yourself by attending these masses, because you are. Obviously, when you do a meritorious act, or say a prayer, then differently from sacramental graces, which produce grace within you, you are meriting grace for yourself by your act of devotion to the Holy Liturgy when you go to a Mass like this, even if it's not, I guess, a valid Mass, and if it doesn't have a validly confected Eucharist at at the mass, but you still are earning for yourself graces. You're still meriting graces for yourself and growing in friendship with God. So even if you're not getting the sacramental graces, you are still in fact growing in grace and holiness, and it's not like your efforts have been wasted. We're not so beholden to another man that, our friendship with God can be ruptured despite our best intentions because of the actions of some malfeasor, of some faithless priest, or some priest in a ignorance, in this inexcusable ignorance. If you are trying to discharge your Sunday obligation and attend the Holy Liturgy, then you are still walking in friendship with God, and you're not responsible for the bad actions of the priest there. So although you're cut off from the sacramental grace that you would ordinarily be receiving through reception of the Holy Eucharist, you're not cut off from like all grace, and you are still earning yourself. You're still meriting graces for yourself. I think that's important because, dude, we can get really scrupulous with this stuff. And people do. You'll hear it in the traditionalist community. They'll be like, well, I think the priest emphasized the wrong word when he said the words of consecration, so I'm thinking that my baptism's not valid. It's like, dude, no, you're fine. Obviously, you want to pay attention, and if there is some heinous thing, you need to note it and maybe point it out to the priest after Mass, so this ends here and now. But don't become a scroop.
Don't be scrupulous. Yeah, I have people who I've known throughout the years that have gotten super scrupulous about this type of stuff and wanted to receive conditionally every single non-repeatable sacrament, all the sacraments of initiation over again because they just weren't sure. It's like, it's overkill at that point, man. I get it. You want to be in your lane. You want to be crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's in terms of what you're doing liturgically and all that. But it's like at a certain point, it's going to be more detrimental to your faith life to be obsessed about these things. Now, if you have actual evidence, like a couple of years ago, we had a priest in the Archdiocese of Detroit who, I think you sort of alluded to this, he was infallibly baptized, but he had video of this. Like, he watched his own video. They screwed up the form of the baptism, the priest or deacon did. He was doing this for hundreds of people, unfortunately. And this priest actually had video of it, so he could actually go back and verify this. But for some of us, we're just never going to know. So God understands these things, just kind of operate on faith. Actually, I went to school with that priest. I know him. I was in seminary with him, actually. So it sort of hits close to home with me. But yeah, that's what the danger of scrupulosity. It's just to get you focused on something, to get you actually away from your walk of faith. But
dude, I mean, that's something though, like the priests who are doing this on purpose, like if I'm not mistaken, the issue with the baptism is he was saying like, we baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, instead of the I baptize you, which is obviously more, I'm baptizing you in the place of Christ, It is I that is doing this as representative of the church. This corporate kind of liberal, squishy, collectivist terminology, that is deliberately inserted in there. And this faithless guy who is doing this, and I can only assume that that is deliberate mischief, because that is actually playing with the liturgical rubrics. At that point, you can't impute them ignorance. You have to impute malice to that, because it's somebody who's actually going out of their way to tweak the rubrics, as opposed to just maybe being in ignorance and buying peach schnapps or whatever.
You could, but maybe that was the way he was taught. You never know.
Sure, it's just I would think that they would consult, their books.
Yeah.
You're gonna consult the Roman Rite, the official liturgical books of the church. I mean, maybe baptism is basic enough where it's like you wouldn't really need to freshen up on that. But at that point, that's something I really don't extend the benefit of the doubt to. I'm not quick to extend the benefit of the doubt there, because to do it that many times over that many years, and with something that's so popularly known as the tripartite formula for baptism, I'm sorry, that does not pass the smell test. That seems like mischief right there. And that guy, I mean, that the punishment for something like that should be severe. Think about it. He is murdering souls. And sure, these people could have a baptism of desire and still get into heaven based on the fact that they wanted to be disciples of Christ. We know that that was the case in the early church with the catechumens who died in the 3-year catechumenate. The early church was always like, yeah, they would have a baptism of desire and they can be saved. That's not the point, though. Like, baptism is the gateway sacrament, and it allows you to have sanctifying grace. And obviously, the presence of sanctifying grace and the ability to obtain for yourself more graces and go into the other sacraments and get the sacramental graces from all of the other 6 sacraments. That's a huge deal. And like, without the aid of the graces from confession and the Holy Eucharist, think how many people are damned. Think how many people, even if they're wanting to be disciples, by virtue of the fact that they are actually cut off from the sacramental graces of things like reconciliation and the Holy Eucharist, they would fall into sin and error much more easily. Obviously, confession steels you against sin, and it gets you out of the mortal sin that you're in. You're absolved of that. But part of the work of the Eucharist and part of the effect of the Eucharist is making you more Christ-like and also steeling you against committing future mortal sins. So if you don't have that kind of armor, you're likely or bound to fall into mortal sin, and that could be putting your spiritual life it's obviously in jeopardy. So these guys who are doing this with the sacraments, they are murderers of souls. They really are. And the punishment for them should be severe.
It really should. And, I need to go back and check, because that happened with the invalid baptisms that, as I said, happened in the Archdiocese of Detroit. I think these were, at least one deacon was doing this. I don't know whatever happened with this guy. I don't know if there's any punishment. I have to go back and check on that. But yeah, you're right. There should be. Gosh, I mean, the Archbishop should come down on him pretty strong. But getting back to your point about just reassuring people that even though they attended an invalid mass, and we want to make it clear, if you screw up any part of the consecration, it actually invalidates the entire mass. So these masses were invalid. But, God takes into account, as you said, your intention to be there, to fulfill your Sunday obligation. There are still certain graces that you can obtain through that. You didn't knowingly do this. Your ignorance is taken into account. So your fulfillment of your Sunday obligation is good. And also, too, even if there is an invalid consecration of one of the species, obviously you use apricot wine, it's not really the body or the blood of Christ, that part is invalid. The consecrated bread, however, the host, is still valid. So for those people who went to those masses, just to reassure you, you did receive at least one, Eucharistic species there. So,
that's true. That's a good point. I wasn't even thinking about that. Yeah, because even though the mass is invalid, because you have to have the consecration of both the body and blood of Christ at a valid mass, and the precious blood was never made. The wine was never confected the precious blood, but the Eucharistic for the body of our Lord, that would have been validly confected, we can assume. So yeah, they would still be getting some sacramental graces. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things a lot of people missed with this whole story is that, invalid mass is okay, but no, that they used the proper matter and the proper form for the host, that would have still been validly confected. So yeah, people would have still been getting something there, and as we know, if you receive one of the species, you receive the entire body of Christ. It's not a half and half thing.
Right. Right.
The other little kind of inside baseball type of stuff is to do when it comes to the mass intentions. Every mass has certain intentions attached to it. You might hear these during the prayers of the faithful. They might mention it before mass. Today's mass is being offered for, so and so, or this whatever. Those would have to be, priests are under an obligation as to when they get a mass intention request. Usually there's a stipend that goes along with that. They're required canonically to say that mass for that intention if they receive it from a parishioner. If they're invalid masses, those intentions were never fulfilled. So there's a big question now of how are all these mass intentions going to be fulfilled from these three parishes. However many years this was going on, no one really probably knows how long it was going on. So the Archdiocese of Kansas City is writing to the Vatican to see how they can resolve this issue.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, when you mess up at first, it creates big downstream problems. When you mess up with the sacraments, when you mess up with the church's liturgy, you're creating giant headaches. You're creating giant knots that are going to have to be untangled later on. And sometimes the resolution for these problems is not quite so obvious because the Catholic faith is so rich, and what we do liturgically is so rich, and there's so many things going on at Mass. When there is a snafu or mischief at play, you really weave a tangled web.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because the victims are people like you and I, people in the pew, and thanks be to God that we're not being judged based on our ignorance. We're still getting a lot of graces, but they're not how they should be based on the either malice or ignorance or whatever going on at the hierarchical level. So I think that's all we got on this one, Dave. Is there anything you want to close up on?
Just the apricot wine, dude. That's really ridiculous. I mean, I don't want to smile or laugh when it's inappropriate here, but just if there's kind of symbolic speech for what is actually happening in a lot of the ordained spheres of the church, in the ordained circles of the church, I think apricot wine is really apropos. It's a really solid it's a really good metaphor for what's going on, because it's such a gay drink, so I think it really is indicative of a lavender mafia in the church. And I'm not trying to, maybe I should hold my tongue because I don't know that's the case here, but apricot wine,
seriously,
please. Yeah, it's so gay.
Now, final question. You say apricot, I say apricot. What's the dividing line here? What's going on? From what I understand, it's the distinction between the British pronunciation and the American pronunciation.
Yeah, it's just how I grew up saying it, man. But we are like Bert and Ernie, we just do different things, and somehow it works out well. But you have the shirt with the vertical stripes, and I have horizontal stripes, and you're pretty, props to you. You're pretty diet conscious, and I eat Twinkies and stuff and processed foods. So it's funny, we do a lot of these things potato type stuff.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on what side of the Mississippi you come from, as the old saying goes. All right, people, we thank you for tuning in. Hopefully your wine at your Eucharistic celebration is valid. We hope and pray that is the case. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, look below to our Patreon link. Help support us, help us grow, help us make more of these videos for your information and entertainment. We look forward to talking and seeing you maybe next time. God bless.